The Unitarian Church in Quincy, Illinois is proud to present the following readings and talk, originally presented Sunday, February 28th at 10:30 a.m. and recorded live via Zoom. The talk this week is titled Bards of the Loom and the Lash, presented by Dr. Michael Keller, the Assistant Professor of English at Quincy University.
Please join me in listening to a poem written by a slave named Africus and entitled The Tears of a Slave. The poem was published in Freedom's Journal on March 14, 1828. This newspaper was the first African-American newspaper in the United States, first published in 1827. The poem is included in a selection of poems from Voices Beyond Bondage. Bill Burns will read the poem. Bill?
A poem from Voices Beyond Bondage, The Tears of a Slave by Africus. Freedom's Journal, March 14th, 1828. Adieu to my dear native shore, to toss on the boisterous wave, to enjoy my kindred no more, but to weep the tears of a slave. By the sons of freedom I'm born, to the land of the free and the brave. From my wife and children I'm torn, to weep the sad tears of a slave. When I think on mother and friends and the joy their countenance gave, ah, how my sad bosom it rends, while weeping the tears of a slave. Ah, now I must labor for gold, to pamper the pride of the knave. Ah, now I am shackled and sold, to weep the sad tears of a slave. Keen sorrow presses my heart, that often I sigh for my grave, while feeling the lash cruel smart, and weeping the tears of a slave. Ye sons of the free and wise, your tender compassions I crave. Alas, can your bosoms despise the pitiful tears of a slave? Can a land of Christians so pure let the demons of slavery rave? Can the angel of mercy endure the pitiless tears of a slave? Just heaven, to thee I appeal. Hast thou not the power to save? And mercy thy power reveal, and dry the sad tears of a slave.
Our second reading is a poem by Mary Ann Mayer and entitled Lords of the Loom and Lords of the Lash. Michael?
Lords of the Loom, Lords of the Lash by Mary Ann Mayer. The beatings, the cleaning of flax and cotton, the carding engine, boards with teeth moving in opposite directions, the pulling of cotton through teeth to comb it, grooming the fibers for spinning into yarn, stretching, twisting, spinning yarn into thread, wound onto spools, then unwound again to make the warp, the weaving of the cloth, the bringing together of warp and weft, the weaving, the unweaving, the unweaving. The Civil War threatens good slave-grown Southern cotton and cotton fever, the hunger for calico and profit raging in the North. For King Cotton, an unholy union forms, planters and fleshmongers of the South, textile magnates of the North, mill owners, fleshmongers, the lords of the loom and the lords of the lash, the engine of freight and cash, feeding the country's insatiable need for printed cloth, printed money. Like a train, like hounds in pursuit, this mill machine and field army, once set in motion, will never be stopped, nor abolished. Vow the lords of the loom and the lords of the lash.
Thank you, Michael. And at this time, it's time for the message, Bards of the Loom and Lash. Thank you. Michael?
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I actually am tempted to toss out my entire talk and spend the time explicating all the things you've shown us today, but you'll certainly see how they're relevant, and I think that they set up very well a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about. Today I want to share some of my research with you and then explore what implications it has for understanding where we are as a society and where we might be headed. For a number of years now, I have been interested in abolitionist poets. Part of this might have to do with the fact that I descend from radical poets in Ireland. So I'm fascinated by people who look at the diseases of their society and say, you know what, I'm going to write a poem about it, and it's going to change some things. Abolitionist poets, radical poets in general, were punk rock before punk rock. Maybe it's just me trying to think that I'm still somehow cool. John Greenleaf Whittier was perhaps the most famous abolitionist of his time, certainly abolitionist poet of his time. Starting in the 1830s, he was writing scathing criticisms of slavery in verse and in prose. It was actually a prose work called Justice and Expediency that he published in 1833 that cost him a future as an elected official, though he worked behind the scenes for years, getting people like Charles Sumner to join the cause. But he was simply too radical for even anti-slavery people at the time. However, it was his poetry that he wielded most violently, as he hacked at the greatest injustice of his day. I'll share some brief excerpts of his work so that you get a sense of what he was doing. In 1835, he responded to a pro-slavery meeting in Boston by writing the following stanzas. Is this the land our fathers loved, the freedom which they toiled to win? Is this the soil whereon they moved? Are these the graves they slumber in? Are we the sons by whom are born the mantles which the dead have won? Later in the poem, he discusses a Yankee farmer and what you would say to a Yankee farmer about his country. Must he be told his freedom stands on slavery's dark foundation strong? On breaking hearts and fettered hands, on robbery and crime and wrong, that all his fathers taught is vain, that freedom's emblem is the chain? I think that discussion about what our fathers have taught us is relevant today, given this backlash against the 1619 study that was put out, and then the 1776 thing that the Trump administration put out. These tensions are still with us. We don't want to see where we've been sometimes. Anyway, that same year, 1835, he read about a pro-slavery meeting in Charleston that was just of clergymen of all denominations. Indeed, as Douglas said in his narrative, revivals of religion and revivals of the slave trade go hand in hand together. But he penned these lines. What? Preach and kidnap men? Give thanks and rob thy own afflicted poor? Talk of thy glorious liberty and then bolt hard the captive's door? Paid hypocrites who turn judgment aside and rob the holy book of those high words of truth which search and burn in warning and rebuke. This was called a poem called Clerical Oppressors. He was going to hit out at anybody who supported slavery. He was a man of principle, a deeply devout Quaker, who was aghast at how Christianity in particular was being used to justify greed, violence, and depravity. More broadly, he was disgusted by how his countrymen could live peacefully and contentedly amidst so much suffering and injustice. I trust you're already seeing parallels to discourses today. Whittier, like many of us, was asking, what kind of a people are we? What is our legacy? And how are we living it out? And how do we change? So as I was researching Whittier's political and literary battles and the historical situations surrounding those battles, I learned a great deal about the kind of person who picks such a fight. There was a very real risk for him. His life was frequently in jeopardy. In 1838, his offices in Philadelphia were burned to the ground by a pro-slavery mob. He had rocks thrown at him. They tried to stone him multiple times, and he was present for William Lloyd Garrison's narrow escape of being lynched. Jacksonian and antebellum Americans had a very hard time. I would argue it was impossible for many to imagine a society without slavery. Sure, slavery was outlawed in the northern states, but the textile industry was absolutely dependent upon the cotton produced by slave labor. The federal government was dependent upon the taxes gained by the slave states. Imagining a slave-free US world would probably be analogous to imagining a country without capitalism today. But Whittier was determined to use the hard edge of his poetic weaponry to perform surgery on the American imagination, to stretch and reshape what we thought was possible. In my humble opinion, this is the role of all great literature. Predictably, Southerners generally not huge fans of his work. Do you all remember the song Southern Man by Neil Young and then performed by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young? Leonard Skinner sure remembered it. They sang in Sweet Home Alabama, "Well, I heard Mr. Young sing about her. I heard old Neil put her down. Well, I hope Neil Young will remember. A Southern man don't need him around anyhow." Indeed, research can come from the strangest places. A couple of years ago, I was conducting a discussion in Polis on Whittier's work, and someone present asked me about pro-slavery poetry. I was aware that it existed, sure, but I certainly needed to look into it more before I answered in any detail. This question, and I wish I could remember who had asked it so I could credit them, has led me into the research I'm obsessed with today, and has helped me understand a lot of the fault lines we're seeing today. For me, I don't really separate scholarship from my own view of the world. I think that I need to be at least informed by what I try to dig into. Now, so a result of this is just my discovery of something that was very popular in the 19th century. The most popular and the longest poetic response to abolitionists in the South was a poem by William J. Grayson called The Hireling and the Slave. It is a monstrous poem, both in length, it's 1,500 lines, and in content. William J. Grayson, for some background, was a mediocre slave-owning South Carolina politician whose career spanned from 1822 as a state rep to 1837 as a member of Congress. The poem in question, The Hireling and the Slave, was written around 1855 and published to great acclaim in the South. In my scholarship, I've put that poem, this poem that I've just discussed, with Whittier's poetry of the 1850s, which gained a different edge. But for now, I really want to talk about Grayson because I think it will help us understand where we've been and where we're going. To speak generally, Grayson's poem is an extended description of slavery as a positive good. People who are familiar with the arguments surrounding slavery before the Civil War know that, we attribute it to John C. Calhoun, saying that slavery is not just a necessary evil, but a positive good. This had become just dogma by the 1850s in the South. In Grayson's preface, he writes that slavery has, quote, made the slave from a savage, an orderly and efficient laborer. It supports him in comfort and peace. It restrains his vices. It improves his mind, morals, and manners. It instructs him in Christian knowledge. Without getting too in the weeds, this is an accurate overview of the positive defense of slavery. And we will be getting into some of Grayson's poetic lines in a minute, but to quote liberally from Grayson's poem, I fear would be too sensationalistic for our discussion today. If you choose to read it on your own, you will find predictably callous, racist, dehumanizing, violent depictions of enslaved African and African-American men and women. And if you're interested, Professor Ibram Kendi has an excellent chapter in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, which discusses the pseudoscience of race in the 1850s that Grayson was relying on and actually contributing to. It was a symbiotic thing. Dr. Kendi doesn't reference Grayson specifically, but Grayson was sucking all of that up. Suffice to say, the ideas that Grayson was poeticizing involved the inherently subhuman nature of African Americans, how slavery saved their souls through the introduction of Christianity, and how it protected them from annihilation by competition with white people. His depictions of slavery are idyllic, where workers are singing as they work, right? As you saw in the clip today. I'm very glad that you showed that, because that was a pervasive myth at the time, that slaves sang because they were happy. Why else would you sing? Frederick Douglass, of course, pointed out that slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. It's how they survived. But But the argument that Grayson puts forward is that these workers never have to worry about finding their own jobs or looking for their next meal. In fact, Grayson argues cruelty to the slave, which is the most, often cited reason for why slavery was bad in Grayson's mind, is outlawed, right? And here's a brief passage. Guarded from want, from beggary secure, he never feels what hireling crowds endure. Hireling is a way of referring to northern workers. Nor knows, like them, in hopeless want to crave for wife and child the comforts of the slave, or the sad thought that, when about to die, he leaves them to the cold world's charity and sees them slowly seek the poorhouse door, the last vile hated refuge of the poor. Rather than worrying about their wives and children ending up homeless and destitute after they have died, slaves can take comfort in knowing that their family is in the kind and loving hands of their owners. Now, before commenting on this passage, I'd like to share a relevant passage from Grayson's own autobiography. He reminisces about being a young man and witnessing the aftermath of a failed slave revolt. Here is his description. But like almost every other plot, the scheme failed. Information was given by one of the slaves, wiser or more timid than the rest. The ringleaders were seized a few hours before the time appointed for the outbreak. They were tried without delay, and 10 or a dozen condemned to be hanged. Their heads were cut off, stuck on poles, and set up along the highway. So, lurking behind Grayson's glowing depictions of chattel slavery are the decapitated heads on spikes to remind these fortunate slaves that there is no escape from their blessed condition. And it is worth asking, if we take Grayson at his word, rather than just assuming he's a bad faith writer attempting deliberately to deceive, it's worth asking how Grayson could possibly justify an evil institution after witnessing its horrors firsthand. Du Bois has a pretty easy, W.E.B. Du Bois, otherworldly intellectual of the turn of the century. First, just as a side note, there's the story of W.E.B. Du Bois graduating from Harvard as the first Black man to have earned a doctorate. And they asked him about this, and he said, the honor, I assure you, was Harvard's. And he was right, but anyway, Du Bois did a study called Black Reconstruction that really, Black Reconstruction in America, that has certainly reshaped my understanding of this time in history, but was extremely important. Du Bois writes, the Southerners were as little conscious of the hurt they were inflicting on human beings as the Northerners were of their treatment of the insane. It is easy for men to discount and misunderstand the suffering or harm done others. I would also point to a famous line from Upton Sinclair, who said, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon him not understanding it. Certainly seemed to be the case with Thomas Jefferson. Now, according to Grayson, the slave is fortunate because he does not have to deal with the conditions that Northern laborers did. In fact, unlike the slave, whom Grayson feels is lucky by comparison, the white worker of the North is the one to be pitied. This is quoting from the poem again. How small the choice from cradle to the grave between the lot of hireling, help, or slave. To each alike applies the stern decree that man shall labor, whether bond or free. For all that toil, the recompense we claim, food, fire, a home, and clothing, is the same. And later on he writes, labor with hunger wages ceaseless strife, and want and suffering only end with life. If you dig into the conditions of industrial workers in the North before the Civil War, you will see that Grayson isn't entirely wrong about what workers, white and Black, were dealing with in northern cities. Sean Willentz, whose work on labor history has been hugely important, describes New York City at the time. He says, this rapid acceleration of New York trade and with the stemming prosperity of the city as a whole came a further deepening of economic inequality and a general deterioration of living conditions in the poorer and middling neighborhoods. The grimmer toll of overcrowding, disease, filth, and mortality in New York's poorer and working class districts reveal the human cost in a city that ranks second to none as a disaster of laissez-faire urban development. If you read about urban industrial cities at the time, and that's where my research has led me, they sound like dystopian hellscapes, especially for industrial workers. So Grayson asks, why don't abolitionists take care of the suffering workers around them? Why do they focus so much on distant philanthropy rather than put their own house in order? Are they immune to suffering in their midst, or are they just hypocrites? Grayson was hitting on a sore spot here because the Northern labor movements often viewed the abolitionists as aligned with the factory owners, lords of the loom. And abolitionists didn't help their own cause when they used the argument that free labor is more productive than enslaved. Whittier did this in Justice and Expediency. If you free the slave, he's going to be more productive. Garrison had a similar argument in some of his work, as if they were trying to free the slaves only to increase productivity and benefit the lords of the loom. In fact, as I was reading through Grayson's critique of Northern industrial capitalism, I was struck by how similar his critiques were to those of Marx, and later Upton Sinclair and Eugene Debs. And I stumbled on a whole industry of Southern apologies for slavery that relied on proto-Marxist deconstructions of Northern industrialism. George Fitzhugh was the most famous one of the time. I won't quote, you get a sense of it, but it's a rabbit hole you can go down. Now, my initial reaction to all of this was to think of this as what we would call today whataboutism, right? 1,500 lines that could be summed up simply by saying a Southern man don't need Whittier around anyhow, right? That is a maddening thing today, isn't it? When you offer a critique of a politician, a policy, or social phenomenon, and you're often silenced by someone saying, well, what about this, right? Well, yeah, it happens to me sometimes when I try to discuss things. My reaction to whataboutism, though, has changed, and I think it's partially because of my research. Garrison and Whittier had a blind spot, especially early on in their careers. They simply could see no similarity between the exploitation of labor in the North with chattel slavery in the South. But the laborers did. The prominent reformer Horace Greeley said in 1845, if I am less troubled concerning the slavery prevalent in Charleston or New Orleans, it's because I see so much slavery in New York, which appears to claim my first efforts. Now, we could criticize them and Greeley for saying, well, yeah, no one owns you like real estate, right? And that certainly is true. They are not the same thing. But nevertheless, those workers were also suffering. Even W.E.B. Du Bois describes the abolitionists and criticizes them for this when he says the abolitionists did not realize the plight of the white laborer, especially the semi-skilled and unskilled worker. Now, this is not all to say that all labor movements in the North were pro-slavery. They absolutely were not. Nor is it to say that all abolitionists were anti-labor. They certainly were not. However, in hindsight, this is a tragically missed opportunity for solidarity. White workers were motivated largely, according to Du Bois, by what he called economic fear. Does that sound familiar? And so some workers incorrectly feared abolition because they thought it would make their economic opportunities more scarce. It simply was not true, but that was their fear, and the Democrats at the time helped stoke that fear. On the other hand, other workers correctly despised slavery because it actually did hurt them economically, especially in the South, by making them compete with enslaved laborers. But had the two joined forces, labor and abolition, to use Du Bois's words, broad philanthropy and a wide knowledge of the elements of human progress would have led these two movements to unite in their union to become irresistible. It was in part economic fear, or economic anxiety, as the euphemism is today, that kept these interests from aligning. Certainly there was a great deal of racism among workers, but we also need to ask where that racism came from. And Du Bois was not speaking derisively of these economic anxieties either. It was a very real hurdle for the workers. Now, there's a lot more to say about this topic, particularly if you are interested in the origins of whiteness, the groundwork laid for systemic white supremacy that we see today. There's also a lot to explore about the nature of art and the role of propaganda and the power of artists to stretch what we think is possible. After all, the moderate or centrist of antebellum America was at best ambivalent about slavery, but certainly didn't think abolition could ever happen in their lifetime. So let me explore briefly and finally two avenues before we go. First, the tensions between abolition and labor and the pro-slavery propagandist attempting to exploit these tensions. Very similar fault lines to today, no? Snake oil salesmen can crop up, right? We need to acknowledge our own blind spots and actively seek to remedy them. We need to seek out cognitive dissonance so that we can push through the psychological strain and continue to grow. Nationalism and partisanship can be a barrier here. For example, when Donald Trump is accused of corruption and sexual predation, Democrats and a lot of people in general are likely to say, of course, that's who he is, right? But when Andrew Cuomo is accused of corruption and sexual harassment, I've noticed a defensiveness there, because that's not who people have assumed him to be. Although there had been reporters reporting on the nursing home scandal for some time before. How can we tell survivors of assault, harassment, that we believe them when we only believe them in certain cases? That is a missed opportunity for solidarity. Now, political affiliation can be essential, of course, but we need to be careful when it leads to hero worship. That's as true of an individual politician as it is of our country itself. For years, I've heard the press bemoan our loss of international leadership. And here we are at the end of February. American bombs are still falling in the Middle East. And I would encourage you to ask the citizens of Tehran how restrained and empathetic our economic sanctions are. Or for that matter, ask the citizens of Venezuela about their willingness to suffer so that a pro-American leader can bypass their vote. One thing that Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Eugene Debs, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Angela Davis, and so many others through Cornell West today have understood is that we have to look at ourselves honestly as individuals, as a people, and as a nation. And we have to understand how these injustices here and abroad are connected. It's no accident, right, that Martin Luther King Jr. was so adamantly against the Vietnam War. He understood that oppression abroad comes home to roost, and that they are interrelated. When we understand these things, understand our connectedness in suffering and seeking justice, only then is true solidarity possible, which means that only then is true change possible. Thankfully, nationally, we are seeing more attention drawn to problems of systemic racism and sexism in our prison system, in our schools, and in our economic system more broadly. But I also think that about where my clothes are made, how palm oil is gathered for my peanut butter, the conditions of workers who make the parts for my iPhone, more immediately, the men and women who pack our meat, work 3 jobs at fast food joints and still can't feed their families. These are just a few examples, and while they may seem scattered, they are all related. My fear is that most of the recent gains in these areas are more symbolic than they are structural. My argument is the only way to justice, to a society centered on mercy, is, in my opinion, is solidarity. That was the missed opportunity of abolitionism and so many other social movements throughout American history. But solidarity is more easily described than it is obtained. Nevertheless, real change is impossible without it. So how do we obtain it? Solidarity, that is. Particularly on the left, I see a lot of ostensibly splintering concerns, all of which are important. Gender, race, sexuality, disability, and class, and a lot of others as well. These are so often depicted as conflicting concerns, but they aren't usually separate in the minds of actual protesters. Imagine if we could find a way to unite these concerns, demand justice and mercy for the oppressed, socially, politically, and economically. I would argue that this is the question of our time. And if we don't find an answer, I fear we are headed in a similar direction that the US would march toward in the 1860s, namely disunion, which, by the way, Whittier supported for some time. Let them have their slave states. We want to be a different kind of country. However, if we do find an answer, one that is beyond my intellectual capabilities at the moment, if we do find an answer, we can unite and in our union become irresistible, to quote Douglas, or to quote Du Bois. But then again, I'm a utopian. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to field any questions or comments people have.